I was standing in my father's kitchen on Mercer Island at 9:17 on a quiet September night when I heard my stepmother say the one sentence that froze my entire body. "She does not need that inheritance, Richard. She is just a temp worker in tech. We will handle the money for her." I stopped mid-motion, a dirty plate still in my hand, the warm water running over my fingers. My father sighed, the tired kind of sigh that comes from years of avoiding conflict. "It is her mother's money, Marissa." That was all he managed before she cut him off with a tone so sharp it could split the room. "Her mother is gone. You are here. And if Ava ever marries some broke boy, half of that money disappears. We are protecting the family, not her feelings." Then came the sound that hit me harder than the words. A glass set down with force and impatient thud. "We move the house, the lake cabin, and the investments into our trust. We give her an allowance if she behaves." My stepmother laughed softly. "She is not that smart. She clicks computers. She will sign whatever you put in front of her." My heartbeat slammed in my chest, but I placed the plate down gently, so nothing made a sound. I stayed hidden behind the kitchen doorway, feeling the air thicken around me. The woman who used to bring me peppermint tea when I was anxious now sounded like someone I had never known. Someone who saw me not as family, but as an obstacle to be managed. I had tolerated her little jabs all these years, the casual humiliations, the comments about my job, my age, my single status, my quiet personality. But this was different. This was about my mother's legacy and my future. I stepped back into the dim hallway, pressing myself against the wall as Marissa's voice dropped lower. "We booked the appointment this week. I already talked to the attorney. Once your signature is on that paper, Ava has zero leverage. If she throws a fit, we will say she is unstable. You know how she gets when she is anxious." My father said nothing. Silence from him always hurt more than the words from her. Marissa continued. "You said it yourself. She is lucky we even let her stay over." Lucky. The word echoed straight into the parts of me that still remembered being the 13-year-old girl afraid to speak up. The girl who learned to make herself small because small things were easier to dismiss. Overdramatic. Too sensitive. Smart, but not practical. All the labels she gave me growing up rose to the surface again. I turned my head slightly, and that was when I saw it. A blue folder sitting near her purse on the dining table, the label printed in clean, bold letters. Cole Family Trust Revision Packet. My pulse spiked. This was not speculation, not a future plan they were thinking about. It was happening now, this week. They were preparing to sign away the assets my mother left behind and tuck me neatly under an allowance, like I was a child who needed supervision. I finally inhaled a slow breath, and for the first time that night my thoughts steadied. My name is Ava Cole. I am 28. I work as a data security analyst for a firm in South Lake Union. I live alone in a small apartment in Capitol Hill with an aging couch and a balcony that leaks during heavy rain. People think I am just another quiet tech girl doing okay in life, earning a stable but modest paycheck. What no one in that living room knew, not even my father, was that 2 years ago, I helped lead a security team at a startup that built a system later purchased by a major corporation. My name never made the press. That was intentional, but my equity turned into something rare and powerful, something with 9 digits, something only my attorney and a private bank were aware of. Richard Cole. My father was a gentleman, a retired high school teacher who always preferred peace over truth. And Marissa Hale, my stepmother, was a polished real estate consultant with perfect hair, perfect smiles, and opinions about everything from paint colors to how much affection a daughter should show. In public, she was warm and generous, graceful. At home, she decided what my father spent when he traveled, who he spoke to, what insurance he should keep, and now apparently what should happen to the inheritance my mother left behind. I felt my fingers curl slightly, not in fear, but in a quiet clarity. I pulled my phone from my pocket, shielding the screen from the living room light. I opened an app disguised as a simple savings tool. A long number appeared, 9 digits. I did not smile. I did not gasp. I only thought one thing. She thinks I am powerless. She is moving pieces on a board she does not even understand. I placed the phone back in my pocket, walked to the sink, and turned off the water. Then I cleaned their dishes like a good daughter who knew her place. And the next morning, before either of them even woke up, I quietly moved $500 million out of their reach. I drove across the I-90 bridge with the rain streaking across my windshield, like thin, restless lines that refused to settle, and the wipers moved in a slow rhythm that matched the heaviness in my chest as the city lights of Seattle blurred in the distance, the radio playing softly in the background, more a hum than a song, and as the tires pressed against the wet pavement, I felt myself falling backward in time to when I was 16, and someone first told me I was too emotional, as if that single phrase had the power to shape every reaction I would ever have. And I remember believing it, then holding it like a private fault to hide even now as an adult who should have known better yet. Tonight, those old words returned with a force I could not ignore. My hands tightened on the steering wheel while my mind replayed the conversation I had overheard, the cold precision in Marissa's voice, the way my father wilted under it, and I could not stop the sharp memory of her long pattern of small cuts. The subtle comments she disguised as jokes, over the years each one delivered with a smile that never reached her eyes. And I remembered sitting across the dining table during one Sunday dinner when she looked at me with that half-amused expression and said, "Wow, coding all day must be nice not having to deal with real people." And I had laughed along back then, brushing it off because it seemed easier than challenging her and drawing out the discomfort that always twisted into my father's face whenever conflict appeared. Another memory rose the time I carried a casserole to their house during a winter storm, wanting to be helpful, wanting to show kindness, and she took the dish with a perfect polite smile before saying, "You did not have to tech, girls. Do not usually cook," as if I were a novelty that did not belong in a real family kitchen. And again, I let it slide, telling myself she did not mean harm, telling myself that maybe this was just her way of relating. But in truth, each comment carved out a deeper sense of distance between us. The rain grew heavier, and the water on the bridge reflected long streaks of white and yellow from the headlights of cars passing in the opposite lane. And as I crossed the midpoint of the span, the memory hit me harder than the others. The one moment that had made something inside me tighten for reasons I could not name. At the time, the day she stood chatting with a neighbor in the driveway, and I approached with a box of my old books. She turned slightly, not quite toward me, and said, "She stays here sometimes. It is like having a tenant." And the neighbor had laughed politely while I stood frozen for a second, because it was the first time I realized she did not see me as a daughter, or even a stepdaughter, but as something temporary occupying space in a home she believed was hers. The feeling came back now sharper, clearer as if she had said it only minutes ago, echoing under the roof of the car. And I exhaled slowly because tonight everything snapped into alignment. The hints, the comments, the calculated distance, and I understood that this was never simple dislike or personality clash. It was control. It was strategy. It was the quiet reshaping of a family so that I slipped to the edges without ever noticing the push. My father had always told me to be patient, to be kind, to remember that Marissa was trying in her own way, that her manner was simply different from mine. And for years I listened because I loved him, and because I convinced myself that peace was more important than pride, that harmony mattered more than the sting of a few careless words, and I repeated that mantra so many times that it became the safety rail I held every time she dismissed me, or belittled my work, or made decisions on behalf of the household without so much as glancing in my direction. But tonight, that rail dissolved. Because this was not about tone or personality. This was about my mother's legacy, her home, her cabin, her savings, the pieces of her life that she entrusted to my father with the belief he would guard them for both of us, and now they were being positioned for someone else's gain while I washed dishes in the next room. The city skyline came into view as I drove past the tunnel, the lights shimmering through the rain like small, scattered stars. And for the first time since leaving the house, I let myself truly feel the shift moving from shock to a quiet clarity, as if my mind was rearranging itself with deliberate care, and a strange calm settled through me, because I knew now that silence would no longer protect anything, and that my role was no longer to endure, but to act. When I reached a red light near the edge of Capitol Hill, I glanced at my phone in the console, catching the soft glow of a notification, and I opened my email for a moment, scanning messages the way I always did after long days. But tonight, one thread caught my eye, a string of formal subject lines from the private wealth management group that handled the remains of my early equity, something I rarely looked at, because the accounts move themselves under the guidance of people I paid to think about things I did not want to dwell on, and I scrolled past, quickly leaving only a hint of their presence, a reminder to the reader, watching from over my shoulder, that something larger existed beneath the surface, yet not fully revealed because the story was not ready for that truth to be spoken out loud. I turned onto my street, the tires hissing over wet pavement, the air heavy with the scent of cold and damp cedar, and I parked in front of my building, sitting for a long moment with the engine off, listening to the rain tapping softly against the glass, thinking about the girl I used to be, the one who stayed quiet to keep the peace, the one who believed shrinking herself made life easier for everyone else. And I realized that girl did not exist anymore. Not after tonight. Not after hearing the woman who married my father reduce me to a liability and strip my mother's memory into an asset to be absorbed into her own future. I stepped out of the car and locked it behind me. My mind steady now because the betrayal had already happened and the clarity had already taken shape, and all that remained was the decision of what to do next, a decision I already felt forming in the silence of the night. The next morning arrived with a gray, quiet sky hanging low over Seattle, and I woke with the kind of clarity that comes only after a night of unraveling every thread of your own past. And instead of getting ready for work like any other weekday, I found myself walking through the cool air of Capitol Hill toward the small corner cafe where I often sat on mornings when I needed to think, the familiar chime of the door sounding softer than usual as I stepped inside and ordered the same simple latte. I always chose something predictable to anchor me as the rest of my world tilted in a direction I had never expected. And as I waited for the drink, I opened my phone and pulled up the contact I had not used in months, the one labeled Diane Brooks, whose voice I could already imagine, steady, calm, efficient with the reassuring precision of someone who handled millions with the same ease others reserved for grocery lists. And when she answered on the second ring, I did not waste a single breath on small talk because there was no space in me for anything except the truth I needed to speak. So I said, I need to move everything quietly by noon. And there was a brief pause on her end, a measured inhale that told me she understood the weight behind those words. Diane asked me to come to her office as soon as possible, and I picked up the latte and made my way back to the street, moving with deliberate steps while the city around me woke slowly in soft layers of sound and movement. And by the time I reached her building near Pike and Pine, my heartbeat had settled into a quiet determination, the kind that comes when you finally stop living in reaction to someone else's power and begin reclaiming your own. When I entered her office, she greeted me with a frown of concentration rather than surprise, as if she had been expecting this moment to arrive eventually. And after I sat across from her, she folded her hands and said, "Before we talk about moving anything, you should know something that happened last month which made my stomach tighten." Before she continued explaining that someone had called her office, asking vague questions about the Cole family assets and whether my portion could be consolidated under a family trust. And though the caller did not identify themselves, the tone was fishing for information in a way she described as deliberately casual but professionally suspicious. And as she spoke, I felt my mind click into place, because there was only one person in my father's orbit who would dare reach into territory that had nothing to do with her. I did not need to say her name because Diane saw the recognition in my face and nodded slightly, confirming what we both understood without having to articulate it. And that moment shifted something inside me because the betrayal I had overheard the night before was no longer theoretical or emotional, but documented and intentional, and already in motion, meaning every hour I hesitated was an hour they could move closer to stripping away what did not belong to them. Diane opened a file on her screen and asked me how comprehensive I wanted the restructure to be, and I told her with a firmness that surprised even me that I wanted everything moved, every account, every holding, every position transferred into an irrevocable trust with me as the grantor and a corporate trustee who could manage the administrative requirements without allowing interference from any individual, no matter how persistent or manipulative, and I wanted protections written clearly and without ambiguity, including safeguards against elder financial exploitation, marital claims and contests from extended family members, all crafted in language strong enough to hold under pressure, because pressure was exactly what I expected would come once this shift became visible to those who believed they were entitled to a piece of my life. Diane typed with sharp, efficient movements, taking notes, asking clarifying questions, confirming timelines, emphasizing that once the trust was executed, the assets would not be reversible in the eyes of anyone except the trust's governing terms, which was exactly what I wanted because I did not intend to allow a single loophole that could be twisted into leverage later. And as she worked, I reached into my wallet for something I had carried with me for years, a small folded note in my mother's handwriting. The ink slightly faded, but still firm and familiar. Reading never let anyone make you feel you owe them the life you built yourself. And I placed it on the desk between us, feeling the gravity settle when Diane looked at it, and then at me, understanding that this was not simply a financial maneuver, but a line drawn to protect something far older and far more personal than money. She asked whether I was certain, and I nodded because there was no hesitation left in me, not after hearing my stepmother speak about my future as though it were an inconvenience she could arrange to her liking, and not after watching my father stay silent so often that silence itself became a language of permission. And while Diane prepared the documents, I sat in that office sipping the now cooling latte, thinking about how easily I had accepted my role as the quiet one, the agreeable one, the one who did not disrupt the fragile peace of a blended household where love had been replaced by careful distance, and where I convinced myself that enduring was the same as protecting. But today I finally understood that protecting meant acting, not shrinking. As the printer hummed and pages stacked neatly on her desk, I felt the faintest tremor of the power I had kept hidden for so long settling into place, and I signed the papers one by one with a steady hand, knowing each signature was a boundary reclaimed and a future shielded from the grasp of someone who had assumed I would always stay small. And when I left her office, the sky had begun to brighten with a pale morning light stretching across the city. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the shift inside me, not a loud, triumphant surge, but a quiet, undeniable certainty that the game had changed, and so had I. The following evening, I drove back to my father's house with the same steady composure I had carried out of Diane's office, although inside I could feel a quiet tension threading through every breath, as if my mind already knew the night would bring a new layer of something I had grown far too familiar with. And when I stepped through the doorway, the sound of voices drifted from the dining room, where my father and a couple from the neighborhood were seated, their laughter light and easy in a way that made the house feel warmer than it often did. Yet the moment Marissa spotted me, her expression shifted into that polished smile she used whenever she wanted to signal hospitality while delivering something far different beneath the surface. She rose slightly from her chair and said, "Kiddo, you made it with a tone that wrapped the word in a softness meant to disguise the condescension underneath." And the neighbors turned toward me with polite smiles as she continued speaking about me as though I were a distant relative, rather than the daughter of the man sitting at the table telling them she is still figuring life out. You know, tech job, no husband, no kids, just working it out and seeing where things go. And although she laughed lightly as she said it, the remark settled over the room like a thin layer of dust, dulling everything it touched while my father shifted in his seat and avoided my eyes. I felt the familiar tightness rise in my chest, the one that came from years of hearing these little summaries of my existence presented as if my life were a vague, unfinished project in need of outside direction. And I managed a small smile while sliding into the empty chair, as if the words had not struck the same place they always did, the place I thought had grown numb, but still ached when someone pressed too hard. Dinner unfolded with the usual rhythm of polite conversation, punctuated by moments where Marissa slipped in remarks that sounded harmless on the surface, yet carried the subtle edge only those who had lived through them could recognize. And at one point she mentioned a minor leak in the roof, and I immediately offered to help cover the cost of repairs. Something I meant sincerely because I did not want my father worrying about household expenses while managing his retirement income. But before he could respond, Marissa placed her hand on his arm and said, "Sweetie, this is our responsibility. Your money is better saved for whatever you do," as if my financial involvement were some kind of burden, rather than genuine support. I nodded and took a sip of water, letting the moment pass. But only a few minutes later, when I excused myself to grab a book I had left in the living room, I paused near the hallway when I heard her speaking in a quieter voice, the tone lower and firmer, as she told my father, "Do not ask her for help. If we involve her financially, she will think she has a say." And I stood there with my hand resting lightly on the edge of the doorway, feeling the words settle, like cold stones at the bottom of a well inside me. The neighbors left shortly after that, and as I helped clear the table, I heard again the phrases I had grown up with, the ones that women across the country have heard in kitchens and bedrooms and family gatherings for decades, phrases meant to reshape their reactions into flaws rather than responses. You are overreacting. You are too sensitive. It is not that big a deal, and each time she used them, I felt a quick, sharp flicker of recognition. Because these were the words that had pushed so many women into silence, leaving them doubting their own instincts, questioning their worth, accepting treatment that was meant to diminish them rather than support them. My father hovered near the sink, organizing plates, with the distracted gentleness he always carried when the air grew tense, and I could see him choosing not to speak up, not to disrupt the fragile equilibrium he believed kept the peace, even though the cost of that peace always fell more heavily on me. And as I watched him move with that quiet avoidance, something in me shifted again. Not the raw hurt of the past, but a new clarity that felt steadier, less emotional, more methodical, as if my mind had begun rearranging every interaction into a puzzle of cause and consequence. The rest of the evening passed with the usual patterns Marissa correcting. Small things I did not do wrong, commenting on the way I folded napkins or placed glasses, or responded to questions as if there were a right and wrong way to simply exist in her space, and I let each remark land without showing the impact, because I was no longer absorbing them in the old way, the way that left me questioning whether I was indeed too sensitive or too dramatic or too easily bruised. Instead, I was cataloging her words, storing them like data points in a system that was beginning to outline a much larger pattern of behavior. And with each small dismissal or quiet jab, I felt the shift from emotional reaction to measured observation. When I drove home that night, the rain had eased, but the street still glistened beneath the streetlights, and as I turned onto my block, I realized that something within me had moved from pain to record, from hurt to clarity, and this new layer of understanding settled through me with a calm heaviness, because now every slight, every comment, every calculated attempt to keep me small was no longer just a discomfort to swallow, but a piece of evidence to carry forward into whatever came next, and for the first time I knew I was not merely enduring her behavior, but learning from it and preparing for the moment she would finally realize that I had stopped playing the role she assigned me a very long time ago. In the days that followed, I found myself moving through each hour with a quiet precision that felt different from anything I had carried before, as if my mind had begun operating on two levels at once, one that performed the small, familiar routines of daily life, and another that watched everything with sharpened intention. And when my father called one morning asking if I could stop by to help him clean up his email because he kept getting notifications he did not understand, I agreed without hesitation, sensing that the moment to confirm what I already suspected had finally arrived. I drove to Mercer Island with the same calm I had practiced since signing the trust papers, and when I walked into the house, Marissa greeted me with that polished smile that never fooled me, yet still slid into place as easily as a switch flipping on. But she disappeared toward the backyard a moment later, and I followed my father to his small study, where he kept an old laptop surrounded by stacks of paper he never quite sorted, and he sat beside me while I powered it on, telling me in his gentle, distracted tone that he felt overwhelmed by the number of emails he had been receiving from companies he did not remember contacting. I offered to set up a better filter system and two-factor verification to help him feel more secure, and he nodded gratefully, leaning back in his chair while I sorted through the cluttered inbox, deleting junk mail, organizing folders, and enabling a more reliable security method, all while he hummed softly to himself, unaware that my attention was fixed not on the task, but on the trail I hoped would reveal itself. It took less than 10 minutes for the first sign to appear, a chain of messages from a law firm in Bellevue that specialized in estate planning, and the subject lines were unmistakable, because they referenced updates, revisions, and scheduling, all words that sent a chill of recognition through me as I clicked on the thread and began reading the most recent email. When I opened the attachments, a series of documents appeared on the screen, cleanly formatted and stamped with the firm's letterhead, and the first file was titled Cole Hale Family Living Trust, which caused a long, slow breath to leave my body before I even finished opening it, because the title alone confirmed what I feared, but the contents took the sting to a deeper place as I read through the clauses outlined with legal precision, detailing how assets would be consolidated under a single entity, overseen not by my father, but by Marissa. And buried deeper in the document was a section that made my fingers still on the trackpad, a clause stating that should I ever be assessed by a qualified professional as experiencing any form of emotional instability, my portion of the estate would be placed under continued management with disbursement, provided only as a limited monthly allowance. I stared at the line for several seconds, unable to move because the words were not only invasive, but familiar in a way that made my stomach turn, echoing every label Marissa had used against me since adolescence: too emotional, too sensitive, unpredictable, overwhelmed. And I realized she had not used those descriptors casually, but as a narrative she'd been reinforcing for years, preparing for the possibility of planting them into something as permanent as a legal document. I scrolled further, expecting to find some indication that my father had pushed back, but instead the next file was an email reply from him to the attorney, written in his simple, unfiltered tone, which had always leaned toward honesty, even when it made things harder to read, and he wrote, "My daughter is emotional. I just want to make sure she is okay if anything happens to me," and the sentence hit with the force of a slow, twisting blade, because it revealed not malice, but fear and misunderstanding. The kind that comes from decades of avoiding conflict and mistaking someone else's manipulation for guidance. And as I read it, I felt both the familiar ache of being misunderstood and the deeper wound of knowing he had allowed someone else to frame my character in terms that would shape my financial identity for the rest of my life. I took a slow breath, steadying myself while he sat behind me, flipping through the newspaper, unaware of the storm that had just unfolded on his computer screen, and I saved the documents quietly to a secure drive, because instinctively, I knew I would need proof of the intent and sequencing later evidence of how far the planning had progressed before anyone had bothered to tell me evidence of how easily I could have been trapped inside a narrative crafted by someone who believed my independence was an inconvenience. The house felt heavier as I continued sorting his inbox, and I could hear the faint clinking of dishes from the kitchen, where Marissa moved with her usual careful elegance, and each sound sharpened my awareness that she had orchestrated this entire structure under the assumption that I would never see it or question it, that I would keep folding myself into the shape she had decided for me, the same shape I had been forced into since childhood. Whenever someone insisted I was too much, too emotional, too sensitive, but sitting there in that study with hard evidence staring back at me, I felt those old identities fall away, leaving something stronger and steadier beneath them. I finished securing his account with new settings, and when he thanked me with a tired smile, I returned it without letting any of the turmoil behind my ribs show, because this moment was not the time for confrontation or revelation. It was the time to gather information and understand the scope of what I faced to prepare for the next step in the quiet strategy I had begun shaping since the night I stood in the kitchen with a dirty plate in my hand, listening to the truth behind their voices. And when I left the house that afternoon, the sky was overcast with a pale, flat light that made the air feel suspended, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that the evidence I now carried was not simply a wound but a weapon, and that I would no longer sit in silence waiting for someone else to decide who I was or what belonged to me. After leaving my father's house with the copied documents stored safely on a secure drive, I felt the shift inside me settle into something colder and more deliberate than anger, a quiet, strategic awareness that told me the time for simply observing had passed, and the time for acting had begun. And that evening, in my apartment with the city lights blinking through the window, I opened my laptop and logged into the secondary email account I had created for my father years ago. When he first began forgetting passwords and asked me to help him organize his digital life, a role he trusted me with, because he believed I was just helping him navigate technology rather than protecting him from the consequences of decisions influenced by someone who did not have his best interests in mind, I moved through the settings, carefully avoiding anything that would look abrupt or suspicious if Marissa ever glanced at the account, and I created a set of forwarding filters that would quietly send copies of any emails from legal firms, financial advisors, or banks directly to a secure inbox. I alone controlled choosing parameters that blended into the existing rules, so the change appeared as a small housekeeping adjustment rather than a deliberate safeguard. Then I enabled a logging feature that allowed me to track sign-ins from unfamiliar devices, alerting me whenever a location or IP address did not match my father's usual usage patterns. The work felt almost clinical, the way placing pieces on a chessboard feels when you already know the direction the match will take. And once I finished, I leaned back for a moment, letting the steady glow of the screen wash over me, as I realized how much of my life had been spent minimizing myself to keep the peace, yet now here I was, leveraging every skill I had learned to counter someone who thought I was too naive to notice what she was building around me. Later that night, long after the rain had tapered off into a light mist, I received the first alert. The system detected a login from a device that did not match my father's tablet or the aging laptop he used in his study, and the timestamp placed the sign in at 1:23 in the morning, a time when I knew with absolute certainty he would already be asleep, since he always went to bed before 11 and rarely woke up until sunrise. My pulse tightened as I opened the log and matched the IP address to a device I recognized from earlier that week, a laptop that belonged to Marissa, one she kept in the living room and often carried into the bedroom when she wanted to handle real estate listings or private calls, and for a moment I sat in the dim silence of my apartment, breathing slowly, letting the confirmation settle through me, not with shock, but with that cold clarity I had come to recognize as the beginning of control. I took screenshots documenting the login pattern, the timestamp, the IP mapping, then saved the files with careful labels stored in encrypted folders, not because I intended to use them immediately, but because I understood that one day I might need to present a full chronology of her actions, a trail that would show intent rather than coincidence, and I was determined to capture every step as it happened, leaving no room for her to rewrite the narrative later. The next day, I returned to my father's house for dinner because maintaining normalcy was part of the strategy, and I needed to understand the rhythm of the household as she believed it still stood unchanged. And as we sat at the table with the faint scent of rosemary chicken drifting through the air, I watched the way she placed herself at the center of every conversation, how she spoke over my father whenever he tried to answer her, how she shaped the tone of the room with a confidence built entirely on her belief that no one would ever challenge her authority. I kept my expression soft, careful, letting none of what I knew reflect in my posture or my voice, and midway through the meal, when the plates had been cleared, and my father had begun describing the upcoming maintenance he wanted to schedule for the house, I looked at him with what I practiced as a thoughtful, casual expression, and said, "Dad, if anything ever happened to you, would you want me to handle your medical bills and the house, or would you prefer someone else to manage things?" The question landed with a mildness that masked its purpose, and I saw him blink in surprise, his fork pausing above the napkin as he tried to process the hypothetical. But before he could respond, Marissa leaned forward with that poised, gentle authority she always used when redirecting a conversation, saying, "Sweetie, we have got it under control. You just focus on your cute tech job." And I felt the soft condescension in her tone settle over the table, like pressurized air. Yet instead of letting it sting, I observed it with the same quiet detachment I had practiced since setting the traps the night before, realizing how much she relied on minimizing me to maintain her position. My father glanced at her, then back at me, confusion flickering in his eyes, revealing the silent conflict inside him, the tug between his desire for peace and his recognition that something in the dynamic no longer aligned with what he once believed about our family, but he said nothing and chose instead to shift the conversation toward dessert, leaving my question floating unanswered in the space between us. I smiled politely, letting the moment fade for now, because the silence itself had told me everything I needed to know about how tightly she was trying to control his decisions, and how deeply she feared the idea of me having any real involvement or authority. And as I gathered my things later that night preparing to leave, I felt the hidden strength of the evidence resting securely in my possession, aware that the game had shifted again, that I was no longer reacting to her choices, but quietly documenting each move and placing my own in ways she could not yet see. And as I stepped outside into the cool night air, I knew with absolute certainty that the quiet war she had begun in whispers and legal drafts was now unfolding on two fronts, one she believed she had already won, and another she had not even noticed I had built beneath her feet. In the days after setting the email traps, I found myself moving through each moment with the same steady calm that had settled over me ever since the night I heard their voices drifting through the kitchen doorway. And although I kept my expression soft and my gestures familiar, whenever I visited my father, the truth was that every step I took in that house now carried the weight of gathering evidence rather than simply maintaining peace. And it was during one of those quiet visits that a new detail surfaced, a detail that shifted the stakes from personal betrayal to something far more dangerous. My father had always been uneasy with online accounts, so when he asked me one afternoon to help him log into his retirement dashboard because he kept getting confused by the new layout, I sat beside him, without hesitation, sliding into the familiar role of the daughter who knew her way around passwords and menus and security prompts, and as he chatted about the weather and the lawn and a book he had started reading. I navigated through the authentication steps with the practiced ease of someone who had done it many times before. But the moment the account loaded, a strange flicker crossed my mind because the balance did not look quite right. I leaned in a little closer, pretending to read through the notifications while he continued talking, and I clicked into the transaction history where the entries were organized in a neat line of dates and amounts. Yet immediately I noticed a series of loans taken against the 401k, each one labeled in vague financial terminology, but showing significant sums withdrawn over the past 6 months, amounts that did not match anything he had mentioned or anything that would justify a sudden shift in his financial planning. I scrolled further, my breath slowing, as I saw multiple reallocation moves, directing funds into unfamiliar accounts, with no consistent pattern or rational explanation. And although I kept my face neutral, I could feel a heaviness tightening in my stomach as the implications formed with painful clarity, because these were not the actions of someone casually adjusting their savings, but the decisions of someone who had gained access and begun shifting money in ways that benefited them, not him. My father continued speaking softly beside me, unaware of what I was seeing, and at one point he mentioned how grateful he was that Marissa had been helping him understand his finances lately, because she seemed to know so much more about these things, and hearing that sentence spoken so innocently made something inside me twist with a slow ache, not out of anger at him, but out of the heartbreaking realization that he had trusted her so completely that he could not see the quiet erosion happening beneath the surface. I clicked into another tab, trying to confirm whether the changes were isolated or part of a larger pattern. And that was when I noticed something that made my pulse catch a separate tab linked to a college fund established years ago for my cousin's son, a young boy who had always looked at my father like a second grandfather. And when I opened the account details, I saw a withdrawal listed under the note emergency family expense. A phrase deliberately broad, yet familiar enough for me to recognize as a cover often used in households where one person assumes they have the right to repurpose shared money without permission. The amount removed was not enormous, but it was significant enough to impact the future of that child, and I sat there feeling a slow, deep wave of disbelief, not because such things were rare, but because they were so painfully common. The same pattern I had heard countless women describe in passing conversations at coffee shops or on phone calls or in support groups or in online stories, where someone borrows from the retirement account or dips into the college fund with the promise of paying it back someday that never arrives because the money was never intended to return. The more I reviewed the records, the clearer the truth became. Marissa had begun weaving herself into every corner of my father's financial life, and he had allowed it because he believed she was helping, because she repeated over and over that she was protecting the family, because he did not understand that she was positioning herself to control everything once he grew older or less capable. And I could see with painful clarity that if anything happened to him, she would inherit not just authority, but total power over every shared asset, including the home, the cabin, the accounts. Bearing my mother's name, the college fund entrusted to him, and even the narrative of my role in the family. I realized in that moment that I was not simply preserving my inheritance, but preventing a slow erasure of everything my mother had left behind. Because once my father passed or lost capacity, Marissa would hold the keys to every decision, and my existence would become an inconvenience she would manage the same way she had managed my presence since I was a teenager. I took screenshots, silently saving the pages one by one into the encrypted folder that had grown heavier with each passing day, a folder filled with the pieces of a story that had been unfolding long before I ever decided to intervene. And once I closed the browser, I turned to my father with a gentle, reassuring smile, telling him that everything looked fine, that I had updated his passwords and security settings, that he did not need to worry anymore. And he thanked me with warm, sincere gratitude, unaware that beneath that moment of calm, a storm of truth had settled fully into place. Driving home later through the soft glow of early evening, I understood that this was no longer a matter of emotional harm or dismissive words or controlling behavior, but a full-scale financial takeover disguised as concern, the kind of exploitation that happens quietly in households across the country, where trust becomes a gateway for someone else to rewrite the future. And as the city lights reflected across the windows, I felt a new certainty rise inside me. A certainty that the world Marissa believed she had crafted so carefully was about to shift beneath her feet in ways she had never imagined. The morning after uncovering the movements in my father's accounts, I woke with a steadiness that felt strangely new, as if all the confusion and disbelief had cooled into something sharper, something deliberate. And as I sat on the edge of my bed in my small Capitol Hill apartment, listening to the muted hum of traffic drifting through the window, I realized that the next stage of this fight could not be emotional. It had to be strategic, so I opened my laptop and began arranging meetings that I had hoped I would never need. By noon, I was seated in a quiet conference room at a private wealth office in downtown Seattle, the kind with soft lighting and glass walls that made everything feel more transparent than it truly was. And across from me sat a representative who had handled several of my investment matters after the acquisition of the startup, a man who greeted me warmly without asking unnecessary questions, because he knew enough to recognize the tone in my voice when I called earlier. Next to him sat an independent financial advisor I had researched on my own, someone with no ties to my family and no incentive to soften any findings, and beside me was Diane, who had become a steady presence in this unfolding situation. Her calm expression, a reminder that preparation was its own form of strength. I explained what I had discovered the night before, describing the loans taken from the retirement account, the reallocations lacking justification, the withdrawal from the college fund, and as I spoke, I watched each person at the table shift from polite attentiveness to focused concern, their eyes narrowing slightly in the way professionals do when the line between oversight and exploitation becomes uncomfortably thin. The representative nodded slowly and said there was a formal internal process for marking an account as suspected financial exploitation, a status that did not accuse anyone but placed safeguards requiring additional verification for future transactions. And when he asked if that was something I wanted to initiate, I felt an unexpected pressure behind my ribs, not hesitation exactly, but the weight of realizing that once I took this step, there would be no return to pretending everything was fine, because the bank itself would be watching. I said yes, quietly but firmly, and he made a note on his tablet explaining what would happen next and how the flag would remain discreet, and Diane added that this was the smartest step before any confrontation, because it preserved my father's financial stability even if he did not realize he needed protection. After discussing the flag, we shifted to the second part of my plan, the family financial review, a phrase that sounded completely benign, but was carefully crafted to do exactly what I needed because I knew Marissa would never agree to a meeting framed as an investigation, but she would accept anything that felt like a privilege offered by a bank interested in helping us optimize our assets. The representative agreed to send a formal invitation that emphasized the opportunity to evaluate long-term planning, something exclusive, sounding enough that Marissa would consider it flattering, and something vague enough that she would not suspect what was really waiting for her. When the meeting ended, I felt a sense of momentum building, a slow tightening of threads that were beginning to pull in my direction. And as I left the office, the chilly air of downtown Seattle filled my lungs with a clarity that bordered on relief. But that clarity did not last long because something else happened that same evening. I had stopped by my father's house to drop off a bag of groceries, wanting to keep my visits feeling routine, so that nothing about my behavior seemed unusual. And as I was in the hallway placing apples into a bowl, I heard Marissa's voice drifting from the kitchen, where she was speaking to a friend on speakerphone. Her tone casual in the way people speak when they believe no one is listening. She laughed lightly as she said that once everything was under her name, she planned to sell the lake cabin because Richard did not need it anymore. and retirement in Arizona sounded better than maintaining an old property with too much sentimental value attached. My hand froze above the bowl because the cabin was not just property. It was the place where my mother had taken me every summer to teach me how to skip stones, where she had braided my hair on the old porch, where we placed a small wind chime together the year before she passed, and hearing Marissa speak about it as if it were nothing more than a burden she intended to discard without hesitation, made my chest tighten with a quiet ache that was somehow deeper than anger. I realized then that this had never been about managing assets responsibly or helping my father plan for the future. It had always been about control, about erasing anything that did not originate from her, about reshaping the family so that my father became dependent on her and I became disposable. A thought that settled heavily in my mind as I stepped away from the doorway and composed my expression before entering the kitchen to hand her the receipt for the groceries. She smiled at me without a flicker of guilt, unaware that I had heard every word, unaware that the cabin she dismissed so casually was the thing that kept the memory of my mother rooted in the world, unaware that in trying to tighten her grip on my father, she had just handed me the final confirmation that I needed to move forward with the plan that was unfolding piece by piece. That night, as I drove home under the dim glow of the streetlights along Rainier Avenue, I replayed her words in my head, not with shock anymore, but with a calm that bordered on purpose, and I understood with absolute clarity that while she believed she was closing in on securing everything for herself, she had no idea that the walls around her were already shifting. No idea that the very system she trusted to validate her decisions would soon be the ones revealing them in the most public way possible. And as the city lights reflected off the windshield, I felt a rare sense of certainty settle inside me. A certainty that the exposure she feared least was the one she would never see coming. I arrived at my father's house later than usual that evening, the sky already dimming into that muted blue that settles over Mercer Island. When the day finally exhales, and as I stepped inside carrying a small container of soup I had picked up for my father, I barely had time to close the door before Marissa's voice cut through the hallway, sharp and polished the way people speak when they believe irritation equals authority. And she said, "It is rude to be late when we cooked for you. Do you know how much we do for you?" Her tone rising with each word as if my simple schedule had personally offended her. I stood still for a moment, letting the syllables settle, letting her assumption of entitlement wash over me the same way it had for years, but tonight something in me did not bend the way it used to. Something held its shape instead. So when I stepped into the kitchen and placed the soup on the counter, I answered with a quiet, steady voice that surprised even me, as I said, "I never asked you to do anything for me." And the room shifted just slightly the way a space does when someone hears a sentence they did not expect from a person they thought they controlled. Marissa's smile froze at the edges, not fully falling apart but cracking, the way thin ice cracks under a single footstep, and she tilted her head, giving me that familiar look of polite disapproval, masking irritation, as she said, "Well, we try to make this a home for you, sweetie, but if you want to act ungrateful, that is your choice." And there was a faint tremble beneath her words that told me she felt the pushback, even though it was gentle. I did not respond because arguing with her had never been the point. I picked up my bag, deciding to leave early and give myself space to breathe, but the moment I stepped past her, she reached out and grabbed my wrist, her fingers tightening with a sudden pressure that startled me, not because it hurt, but because it revealed something she had hidden well, a need to physically anchor me in place, when her words no longer did the job, and she leaned in so close I could feel her breath against my ear as she said, "You will not disrespect this house, not while you are still attached to our name." The sentence delivered in a whisper, so controlled it almost sounded rehearsed. I stood very still, letting her grip settle around my wrist, feeling the cold certainty in her tone and the quiet threat beneath it. and I looked at her without raising my voice or pulling away because something in me had gone still and quiet, the same stillness that arrives when the world sharpens into clarity. She held on for a few more seconds before releasing me, her face smoothing back into its practiced composure, and that was the exact moment my father walked into the room, holding a folded newspaper, looking tired the way people look when they want harmony more than truth, and his eyes flicked from my face to Marissa's hand, still hovering in the air, then back to me. And for one long, fragile moment, I hoped he would see me. I hoped he would recognize what had really happened. But instead, he sighed. The same weary sigh I had grown up hearing whenever conflict threatened to disrupt his fragile peace, and he said, "Ava just apologized, she has been under stress," the sentence falling from his mouth with the weight of a verdict not malicious but familiar in its disappointment, because it was the same pattern repeated over and over through my childhood, the pattern where his comfort mattered more than my hurt. I looked at him not angry, but emptied in a way that surprised me, because in that moment it became painfully clear that he did not understand he was asking me to apologize for a wound he refused to admit existed, and that realization settled like a cold stone in my chest, not heavy enough to crush me, but heavy enough to remind me why I was doing all of this. Marissa crossed her arms, watching me with that quiet, victorious expression people wear when they believe they have reclaimed the ground they momentarily lost, and I could feel the old instinct rising in me, the instinct to shrink, to soften, to smooth the edges, so everyone else stayed comfortable, but the instinct did not complete itself. This time, it simply hovered and then dissolved into nothing, replaced by a stillness that felt like a doorway opening inside me. I told my father softly that I was going home and that I would see him later in the week, and although he nodded in a distracted way, his eyes never truly met mine. They lingered instead on the tension in the room, as if he wanted it to evaporate, without him needing to understand its cause. As I walked out the door, I felt something shift behind my ribs, not a breaking, but a closing the soft part of me that once waited for fairness or recognition, sealing itself off, and the pain that had flared inside me earlier began to flatten into something cold and clear, the kind of clarity that comes when a person realizes that the people they hoped would protect them are the very ones who hand them over to harm. Driving back towards Seattle with the streetlights flashing across the windshield, I replayed the scene in my mind, not to analyze it, but to acknowledge it, because tonight marked the moment I stopped trying to be understood and started preparing to be undeniable. The ache inside me was gone, replaced by a still, steady calm, and I understood with perfect clarity that I was no longer the girl who swallowed her hurt. At 16, no longer the young woman trying to earn a place in a house that had never wanted her. I was someone else, now someone who had stepped fully into the quiet power she had kept hidden, someone who no longer needed their approval. Because the truth was, I had already outgrown the walls they tried to keep around me. The afternoon light settled softly across the backyard as guests filtered in, carrying desserts and bottles of wine, the familiar hum of small talk floating around the lawn, while lanterns strung between maple trees flickered gently in the breeze. And although I stood near the patio steps with a plate of fruit in my hand, I felt the tight coil of anticipation beneath my ribs. Because this was the day everything shifted. The day the shadows Marissa had hidden behind would finally dissolve under the weight of her own choices. It was my father's 60th birthday, a milestone he had once imagined celebrating quietly, yet Marissa had insisted on a backyard gathering that felt more curated than heartfelt, a display of hospitality that seemed designed more for her audience than for him. And as relatives greeted me with warm smiles and neighbors commented on how grown up I looked since they last saw me, I kept my expression soft and steady, knowing exactly what the next hour would reveal. Marissa moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who believed she owned every inch of the space, dressed in a carefully chosen pastel dress that conveyed elegance and control, and she greeted each guest with a bright smile, speaking about the work she had put into the new garden layout, the renovations she spearheaded, the plans she'd made for Richard's retirement, as if she were the architect of every good thing in his life. I watched my father hover near the grill, laughing politely with two former co-workers, and although he looked tired, the lines around his eyes softened whenever someone congratulated him. Yet even from where I stood, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the quiet heaviness he carried without knowing its origin, and part of me wished the truth did not have to land on him in such a public way. But another part of me knew he deserved clarity, even if it arrived wrapped in discomfort. As the sun dipped lower and guests settled into the rows of folding chairs that Marissa had arranged perfectly across the lawn, she tapped her glass with a delicate spoon and waited for the chatter to fade, her smile widening the moment all eyes turned toward her, and she began speaking in that practiced warm tone that always made my skin tighten a tone she reserved for moments when she wanted admiration more than sincerity. She spoke about Richard's years as a teacher, about how she had supported him through stressful transitions, about the stability she had brought into their home, and then she pivoted casually to what she called their shared vision of the future, adding, with a small laugh, that our girl in tech would be just fine, even without old-fashioned savings. A line delivered with such lightness that several people chuckled without realizing its sting, while I sat still feeling the familiar heat of humiliation rise before settling back into the calm I had trained myself to hold. She ended her speech by saying that the next portion of the gathering would include something special, a workshop from their bank about planning for retirement and ensuring family assets were managed responsibly. And she gestured toward the representative standing near the garden archway, a man in a navy blazer who gave a polite nod before stepping forward to address the group. I watched Marissa take her seat, adjusting her dress, smoothing her hair, clearly expecting the presentation to validate everything she had orchestrated. But the representative unfolded his papers slowly, then looked directly at Richard before speaking, and his first sentence cut through the warm evening air like a blade as he said, "We are here today because there have been concerning movements in Mr. Cole's accounts," and every conversation in the yard faded instantly, leaving only the sound of a distant lawnmower on the neighboring property. Marissa sat up straight, her smile faltering just slightly as several relatives turned to look at her, and before she could interject, I rose from my chair, walked toward the outdoor TV that had been set up earlier for a slideshow of old photos, and using the remote, I cued the first file that appeared on the screen, a screenshot of a login to my father's email account at 2:30 in the morning from an IP address traced back to Marissa's personal laptop. A murmur rippled through the guests while my father stared at the screen, his brow tightening, and I continued switching slides, revealing the withdrawal logs from his retirement account, the transactions from the college fund labeled Emergency Family Expense, and finally the draft of the Cole-Hale Family Living Trust displaying the clause that would restrict my inheritance if I were ever deemed emotionally unstable, a clause that Marissa had insisted be included. Gasps and whispers spread across the yard like wind moving through tall grass, and Marissa shot to her feet, her face draining of color, as she stammered that I had hacked her computer, that I was twisting things, that none of this was what it looked like. But her voice shook and rose in pitch, betraying the panic she tried to mask. I stepped forward calmly, not raising my voice, and said, "Everything here came from bank logs and your own emails, Marissa. I just saved them before you could erase them." And the stillness that followed felt heavy and electric, the kind of silence that settles when truth enters a space that has been waiting far too long to be seen. My father swallowed hard, his eyes jumping from the screen to Marissa to me, confusion giving way to horror as he realized the signatures he barely remembered, the documents he had been urged to sign. The trust revisions he had believed were routine were part of something far more deliberate, and he lowered himself slowly into a chair, gripping the armrests as though the ground beneath him had shifted. Guests looked away, uncomfortable or stunned, some glancing at me with empathy, others shaking their heads in disbelief, and Marissa stood frozen, her hands trembling at her sides, as the narrative she had built so carefully for years unraveled in front of everyone she had tried to impress. I held her gaze for a moment, not triumphant but steady, because this had never been about humiliating her. It had been about revealing the truth and protecting my father. And as she searched for another excuse, another escape, another lie that might shield her from the consequences, the depth of her silence became the final confirmation of everything she had tried so desperately to hide. Richard sat heavily in the nearest chair as though his legs had given out beneath him, his hands trembling in a way I had never seen before, and the guests who remained in the backyard shifted uncomfortably as the weight of what had just been revealed settled over the space like a dense fog, while he leaned forward staring at the documents on the outdoor table. Documents bearing his signature, in places he clearly did not remember signing, and he whispered almost to himself, "Why would I sign this? When did I sign this?" As if the lines on the page were rearranging the entire landscape of his understanding. I watched the realization move through him, slowly, first confusion, then disbelief, then a dawning horror as he recognized his own handwriting beside clauses that would strip him of control over his home, his savings and the legacy he wanted to leave behind, and the silence around us grew sharper as several of the older women in the crowd exchanged knowing glances, the kind that carried years of witnessing similar patterns in their own families, and they looked at me with quiet sympathy that said they understood more than they wished they did. Marissa hovered near the patio steps, her posture rigid as she scanned the faces around her, calculating her next move, but panic flickered across her expression when I pressed a small button on my phone and a recording began to play softly over the outdoor speakers, the voice, unmistakably hers, saying, "He signs anything." I put in front of him, "He does not read," which had been captured during her call with the advisor a week earlier. A collective gasp rippled through the guests, and several relatives began whispering while Richard closed his eyes briefly, as though the sound itself was a blow to the chest. And when he opened them again, there was a sharp clarity behind them that I had not seen in years, a clarity that came from finally recognizing he had been guided, manipulated, and reassured into decisions that were not his own. He drew a slow breath, then stood shakily and told everyone the evening was over, thanking them for coming and asking them to please give the family privacy. And within minutes, people dispersed down the driveway, murmuring to each other, while Marissa avoided every pair of eyes that drifted toward her, clutching her phone as though it were the only solid thing left to hold. Once the yard was empty, except for the three of us, the hum of the outdoor refrigerator was the only sound until my father motioned for us to go inside. And as the sliding door closed behind us, he turned to Marissa with a steadiness that seemed to surprise even him and asked her directly, "How long have you been doing this? What else have you signed under my name? What else have you taken?" Marissa's expression shifted instantly, the practiced poise melting into something harder and more frantic as she stepped closer to him, lowering her voice into a tone meant to intimidate, saying, "If you undo this, we both go down. You signed Richard, you signed everything. And if anyone sees that you were not paying attention, it will not look good for you." Her words curling around the room like smoke as she tried to regain control by leaning on fear. My father recoiled slightly, not from physical danger, but from the realization of the emotional leverage she thought she still held, and he looked at her as though he was seeing a stranger, someone wearing the face of the woman he believed had cared for him, but whose intentions were now exposed under harsh light. He whispered, "Marissa, why would you do this?" And before she could answer with another rehearsed line of self-preservation, I stepped forward, gently placing a hand on his arm and speaking with a calm I had learned to maintain even when my pulse raced. "Dad," I said softly, I am not here to take anything from you. I never was. I am here to stop her from taking everything from both of us. And I waited for him to meet my eyes so he could see the sincerity beneath the words. The same sincerity he had trusted when I was a child and ran to him after nightmares, even though somewhere along the years he had stopped trusting his own instincts. Marissa scoffed loudly, accusing me of trying to manipulate him, of wanting to seize control under the guise of being helpful, calling me inexperienced, emotional, unaware of how real finances worked, and the irony of her lecturing me about financial awareness nearly made me laugh, except that the stakes were too high for humor. My father looked back and forth between us, his breath uneven as he processed everything, and in that moment, I knew he needed reassurance, not just that he was safe, but that he was not alone. So I added quietly, "Dad, if I have to, I can cover your retirement. You are not trapped by whatever she tried to build around you. I am not as broke as she thinks." The room stilled at those words, and Marissa's head snapped toward me with a sharpness that betrayed her shock because it was the first time I had ever hinted at the truth behind my finances. The truth she had dismissed for years, believing I lived paycheck to paycheck in a modest apartment while she maneuvered the assets she imagined were her entitlement. Richard looked at me with confusion, mixed with wonder, trying to reconcile the image of the daughter he thought he knew with the woman standing in front of him now, someone who had quietly built a life far more stable and independent than he had realized. And in that silent space between us, something shifted, as if a veil had been lifted, revealing that he was not only allowed to question what had happened, but allowed to trust me again. Marissa opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to bargain, perhaps to threaten again, but my father raised his hand, stopping her mid-sentence, and said, "I need time. I need space. I need to think," and his voice wavered yet held a firmness that made Marissa step back, understanding that the version of Richard she could steer with guilt and pressure was no longer standing in front of her. As I watched him sink slowly onto the living room couch, staring at the stack of documents in his hands, I felt the first tremor of what would become a long process of rebuilding not just his finances, but his self-trust, and I knew this moment was not the end of the conflict, but the beginning of truth finally coming into the light. A few weeks passed in a strange quiet that felt neither peaceful nor chaotic, but suspended somewhere in between, as if the house itself was holding its breath. And during that time, the consequences that had begun on the night of my father's birthday party unfolded with a steady and undeniable rhythm. The bank formally restricted Marissa's access to every account she once managed, with her usual confidence locking her out of online portals and requiring in-person verification for even the most basic inquiries, and her financial advisor, who had once praised her for being proactive, suddenly withdrew from their working relationship, citing concerns about compliance and liability. Richard, shaken by the discoveries and newly aware of the extent to which he had been manipulated, quietly met with a family law attorney unaffiliated with anything Marissa had ever touched, and within days he filed for divorce, a decision made not in anger, but in tired resolve, and although he did not celebrate it, he carried a new clarity that I had never witnessed in him before. I kept my distance during those weeks, giving him space to process, while making sure he understood I would support him without controlling him, and slowly he began to ask small questions about finances, about options, about what life could look like, without the shadow he had lived under for nearly a decade. It was in the middle of this fragile transition that I received the text message from Marissa, a simple line that read, "We need to talk," followed by the address of the Safeway on the edge of Mercer Island. And although every instinct told me to ignore it, something colder inside me told me to go, if only to see the end of the story she had written for herself. The parking lot was washed in the dull glow of late afternoon light when I arrived, and I spotted her leaning against a shopping cart return station, wearing oversized sunglasses and a jacket that hung loosely on her frame, a stark contrast to the meticulously curated version of herself she once displayed to the world, Yet even in that disheveled state, she straightened when she saw me approaching, as if preparing to step back into a role she no longer had the power to play. "Ava," she said with a clipped, breathy urgency, as though we were old allies meeting in secret rather than adversaries, separated by her own choices. And before I could speak, she launched into her pitch, her voice low and tense, saying, "If you drop the report with the bank, I can walk away quietly. You do not want a scandal. You do not want this dragged out. Trust me, it will get messy for everyone." She tried to make her words sound cooperative, reasonable, even protective, as if she were offering me a lifeline instead of fishing for one, and then she added with a brittle laugh, "You are single, no kids. How much do you really need?" Which was not only insulting but revealing of the belief she had always carried that my worth could be measured by marital status or the number of dependents attached to my name. I let her finish watching the desperation flit across her face as she waited for me to rescue her from consequences she had architected herself, and when I finally answered, my voice was calm, but so cold it startled even me. "You did not just go after my money," I said slowly. "You gambled with my father's future. You gambled with his retirement and his autonomy, and even my little cousin's college fund. You did not make a mistake, Marissa. This is who you are, and you knew exactly what you were doing." She tried to interrupt with a quick defensive protest, but I continued speaking evenly over her, saying, "The bank has already flagged you in their system for suspected financial exploitation, and if you push this any further, I will cooperate fully with their investigation. Every log, every file, every recording I have will go exactly where it needs to go." The words settled between us like a cold wind, and for a long moment she said nothing, her jaw clenching as she absorbed the reality she had been trying so desperately to outrun, and I saw the exact second her confidence slipped into fear, not fear of me, but fear of a world no longer shaped by her influence, where her access to my father's accounts and assets and stability had evaporated. She looked away toward the grocery store entrance, where families pushed carts and teenagers collected stray trolleys as though wishing she could disappear into the ordinary noise of their lives. Then she tried one more weak attempt, saying, "You do not have to ruin me." But the plea lacked conviction, and we both knew it. I took a slow breath, letting the tension leave my shoulders, then answered with finality, "I am not ruining you, Marissa. I am stepping out of the way while the truth does what it always does." And the silence that followed was not dramatic, but decisive. The end of a long manipulation dressed as partnership. She stared at me for several seconds, her expression tightening first in disbelief, then in resignation, then in something like silent rage at the loss of control she once wielded so easily, and without another word, she turned away, walking briskly toward her car, her keys jangling in her shaking hand. I watched her drive off quickly, weaving through the exit lane as if speed could outrun consequences, but deep down, she already understood what waited for her, because every door that had once opened effortlessly at her touch had now begun to close one by one, and she was finally facing a life governed not by the stories she told others, but by the truth she'd tried so hard to bury. Spring arrived with a softness that felt almost unreal after the months of tension that had reshaped everything I thought I understood about my family. And on a cool April morning in 2025, I found myself sitting on a wooden bench overlooking Lake Washington, watching sunlight scatter across the surface in long, quiet ripples, while trees along the shoreline swayed gently as if exhaling after a hard winter. I pulled my jacket a little tighter around me, breathing in the crisp air that carried the faint smell of early blooming flowers, letting the calm settle into my bones. Because for the first time in a long time, I was not bracing for the next betrayal or the next manipulation or the next moment when the ground might shift beneath my feet, and instead I allowed myself to simply be present in the soft quiet that followed a storm that had taken far too much energy to weather. My father now lived in a small rental home a few miles away, a place with a garden he tended every morning, and a kitchen that finally felt like his again. And though the house was smaller than the one he had shared with Marissa, it held a kind of peace that could not be bought or designed or curated. He no longer checked over his shoulder when making financial decisions, no longer hesitated before opening his bank statements, no longer carried the heavy confusion that had clouded his days, and even though he did not know the full extent of the financial support I had quietly provided, such as paying off lingering debts he had not realized were accumulating and helping reset his retirement plan in a way that protected him from further vulnerability. I did those things not because he owed me gratitude, but because I finally understood that love sometimes meant stepping in before someone realized they needed help. As I sat by the lake, I thought about everything that had happened. The emails, the trust documents, the lies spoken in calm voices, the weight of silence that had once kept me compliant. And I let those memories drift across my mind like passing clouds, acknowledging them without letting them define the horizon ahead of me. My phone buzzed lightly beside me, and when I glanced down, I saw a familiar name on the screen, the board chair of the startup where I had once been team lead in cybersecurity before the acquisition that had quietly changed my life. And when I answered, a row of familiar faces appeared in the video frame, smiling warmly as they told me they had a proposal they hoped I would consider. They said, "We have been discussing bringing you on as an advisor again, Ava, and we want to offer additional equity because your strategic approach during the transition still shapes how we operate." And I felt a mixture of gratitude and quiet pride swell in my chest, not because of the money, though it would undeniably increase my already substantial assets, but because the recognition came from people who saw my work clearly without underestimating me or projecting their insecurities onto my achievements. It was a gentle revelation of power, one that did not need to be wielded loudly to exist, and as I ended the call, I felt something shift inside me, a confirmation that my worth had never depended on anyone's permission or approval, especially not the people who had once belittled me for being too quiet, too logical, too sensitive, too young, too single, too obscure. I leaned back on the bench, watching the reflection of the sky ripple across the water, and I thought about the women who had written to me over the past few months, women who knew what it felt like to be spoken over, dismissed, controlled financially or emotionally, women who had stayed silent to keep the peace until the peace cost more than speaking ever would. And I realized how many of us had been taught to confuse silence with weakness, when in truth, silence could be a form of strategy, a way to protect what mattered until the moment came to step forward with clarity. I had never flaunted my financial independence, not because I was ashamed of it, but because revealing it too early would have turned me into a walking wallet in my family. Dynamic, a source to exploit rather than a person to respect, and keeping that part of my life private had allowed me to move strategically when the situation demanded it. Sitting by the water, I realized that my journey was not just about reclaiming money or property or legal rights. It was about reclaiming my sense of self and the understanding that I did not have to apologize for setting boundaries or for protecting what my mother had left me or for choosing to live a life on my own terms. I looked out at the lake one more time, letting the quiet settle fully before speaking softly into the breeze, as though addressing every woman who had ever been told she was too much or not enough at the same time. And I said to myself, silence is not weakness, and keeping your power private is not shameful. But if someone tries to steal your future, you are allowed to stand up and you are allowed to do it without apology. And if any part of this felt familiar to you, if any moment reminded you of something you have lived through or watched someone else endure, tell me where you are listening from, because your comment might be the one that reminds another woman that she is not imagining things. She is not overreacting. She is not alone.